All right, good morning. As I mentioned yesterday, Johnny Burtka, the president of ISI. It's a tremendous honor to welcome you to our fourth annual homecoming celebration. We are a little full in this room this morning, so you're free to stand and watch, but also if you do want to sit, you can go out on the back patio. We have the program live streamed, so you can watch it in real time as well out on the back patio. Before we get started with a word about our program and speakers, a few thank yous are in order. First, I do want to thank, again, Rich and Carol Griswold Bacciagalupi. Rich is a new board member at ISI, and just a few moments ago, we were up on the third floor of our headquarters dedicating our new media studio. So we have lots of new digital content we'll be coming out with, and I'll give you a sneak preview of that in a moment. But thanks so much to Rich and Carol. And I also want to thank Regis Rommel. He's also a new trustee, and his foundation and company, Stratus Aviation with Fly Advanced, is sponsoring the Brandywine Speaker Series, which if you're a local, I would encourage you about once a quarter. We have evening lectures. Today we have a morning panel that is sponsored by them. So thank you so much, Regis. This morning, the theme of our conference is America 2024, a conflict of visions. So obviously, it's an understatement to say there's a conflict of visions at the national level between right and left, Democrats and Republicans, but there's also a conflict erupting within the conservative movement itself that sometimes is constructive and sometimes is counterproductive. And today we gather and we're taking a look at three historic case studies with the hope that they might shed some light on our current political situation today. So our first panel deals with presidential leadership. We'll be looking at the legacies of President Reagan and President Nixon and what they have to teach us about our current moment in politics. The second panel, which I'll be moderating, focuses on religion in the early American Republic and the relationship between Christianity and politics in America. And then the final panel focuses on the book by ISI's founding president, William F. Buckley Jr., God and Man at Yale, taking a look at free speech on college campuses both then and now. So it's an exciting lineup. You'll hear a variety of perspectives. Our panelists at times will voice strong disagreements, but the debate that we have here at ISI, just like on college campuses, is always in pursuit of truth. It's in pursuit of unifying both the conservative movement and America. So before we get to the panel, I do want to show a sneak preview, a trailer of our new video podcast called Daring Greatly, which is a series in 12 parts on the history and the art of statesmanship from Greece and Rome going all the way to our present day. And I'm also excited to share that the Blaze Media Network is going to be picking up the show, so it'll be jointly branded between ISI and the Blaze and releasing in the next couple of weeks. So without further ado, we're going to show a brief clip for the series. Apologies to people sitting on this side of the room. It might be a little difficult to see.
When we think about Washington, D.C. today and the individuals at the commanding heights of American government, the very last word that comes to mind is statesmanship. The heroes whose monuments line the National Mall, Washington, Lincoln, Jefferson, seem lost to history, almost mythical, so far removed from the reality of day-to-day politics in Washington, D.C. that we see on cable news.
People don't care about the country.
Yeah.
They don't understand our history because they haven't been taught it.
We've thrown out all the paradigms that have given inspiration to the founding fathers. I mean, these guys were Plutarch nuts. They were maniacs for biographies of the great leaders of the past, the Caesars, the Alexanders, the Pericleses.
The good soul doesn't simply just come into existence. It requires a kind of formation. And that formation requires a social context and a political context, tradition and education and all of the things that ISI is dedicated to.
This too is part of Nixon's legacy. A guy who doesn't just follow the pack, a guy who has an independent vision for where we need to go. And in his case, it was a deeply pragmatic vision when it came to foreign policy, but it's exactly what we needed.
In fact, the very notion of statesmanship is derided in the modern world. This has been the case ever since the progressive era, where bureaucracy, management, and expertise replaced a classical understanding of virtue and statesmanship in government and public life.
Government is there actually to encourage virtue. St. Thomas Aquinas recognizes statecraft is not about your philosophical fancies. It's about advancing the common good. It's about giving people the political conditions to flourish.
Virtues are expected from both men and women and are expected of all of the estates.
As you look at our own nation, what is it about America that's unique, that we have the great leaders that we need in these moments of crisis, the Civil War, World War II?
Read about Washington and you might say to yourself, I'll never accomplish that. You may be right. Well, what if I told you about a farmer, a grocery store owner, and a longshoreman? You go, okay, I can relate that story. Then what if I told you that's your story?
Richard Nixon had a contrarian, scrappy nature to his rise and to his leadership. He was the godfather, I would say, modern foreign policy realism. And I think the lesson for today is we can't just talk about gutting the bureaucracy or draining the swamp. You got to go in and do it. And if not, you're in some ways in the worst position of all.
There are scant resources available to educate the next generation of leaders who will save America and the West. This show aims to change that. Together, we will discover the political wisdom of mankind.
Thank you so much. So that'll be available on YouTube and Spotify and wherever you get your podcast. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Susan Hanssen. She's a professor of history at the University of Dallas, a longtime professor in ISI's honors program, and an alum of our Weaver Fellowship. So Susan, take it away.
Thank you. Well, welcome to this morning's panel on Reagan and Nixon Revisited. When I was invited to moderate this panel, I was very excited. I've been the faculty advisor for the University of Dallas's student ISI chapter for the past 10 years. And so this conversation about 20th century conservatism and 21st century conservatism is a conversation that I've been engaged in with the students for the past 10 years. And so at first, when I was invited to moderate this panel, I thought that this was going to be a Trumper never Trumper conversation. But I've realized that since then, George Will has actually endorsed Kamala Harris to a certain degree. But this is not a political debate about the election. This is a conversation about history and about continuity and change between the conservatism of the Nixon-Reagan years and the conservatism that our students are being introduced to in the 2010s, 2020s. And so I wanted to introduce our speakers. I think that some of them don't need introduction, but for the younger members of our crowd, I think it's worthwhile. So we have Lord Conrad Black, who is a long-time newspaper publisher, both in the United Kingdom, Canada, and the US. And he's also published books admiring biographies of 3 American presidents, Franklin Roosevelt and Nixon, and also Donald Trump. And then we have George Will, who has been writing for the Washington Post since 1974. And in 1977, he got the Pulitzer Prize for his commentary. He worked as a speech writer or a speech prepper, right, for Ronald Reagan, and has been a long-time commentator in the Washington Post and MSNBC and NBC News. And then we also have our very own Dan McCarthy, who is the publisher of ISI's publication Modern Age, which was founded along with ISI back in the 1950s. He worked for about a decade for the American Conservative before coming on as editor-in-chief for Modern Age. And so all 3 of them are really capable of speaking to sort of the long view of the conservative movement and whether we're really looking at a kind of radical change in the conservative movement, or whether we're looking at something of a continuity. So perhaps we can start with Lord Black, and then have opening statements also from George and Dan. So first of all, I would just like to ask when we look at particularly the Nixon and the Reagan administrations, what are some of the strengths and weaknesses of those presidencies and the leadership style of those presidencies that current Republican leadership can learn from?
Well, they were both very talented, I should say. I just want to make sure that I have this right. Do I now have a mandate to speak for 7 minutes, or just?
Yes.
Okay. In the case of Mr. Nixon, I put it to all of you that he was, in fact, a very successful president, despite the unfortunate ending of his presidency. And I would go further and say that his one term as president was one of the most successful in the history of the country, surpassed only by Mr. Lincoln and I think probably Franklin D. Roosevelt's first and third terms. And I'll tell you why very briefly. It was he who ended segregation and avoided the chaos that the courts had ordered of busing tens of millions of school children all around the metropolitan areas of America in pursuit of racial balance. And he did it by organizing the private sectors in each state in the African American and Caucasian communities to work it out between themselves, largely under the general aegis of George Shultz, and it worked. He, as we all know, when he was inaugurated in 1969, and I guess before the time of many of you, but those of us, and I have a ghastly sinking feeling that I may be the oldest person in the room, but when he came into office, the country was racked with riots and huge demonstrations all around the country, all the time, every week, race riots and anti-war riots. And there were 545,000 mainly conscripts, draftees, in Vietnam, 200 to 400 of them coming back in body bags every week, and no exit strategy, no negotiations. They'd negotiated for almost a year over the shape of the table that they were supposed to negotiate at in Paris, and that's what he faced. And we had skyjackings, and that was the year of the assassination of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King. It was a very, very difficult time, and he was the first president since Zachary Taylor in 1848 to come into office with his party not controlling either house of Congress. So he, as you know, at the end of his first term, he had effectively evacuated American forces from Vietnam while maintaining a non-communist government in Saigon. And his view was that if, as he assumed, North Korea violated the peace accord that was about to be signed, they would revert to the policy that worked in April of 1972 between Mr. Nixon's return from China and his trip to the Soviet Union, which was overwhelming American air support. But the war on the ground was entirely conducted by the South Vietnamese, and they were victorious. So it wasn't a fake peace. It had the potential to be a real peace. He had, of course, opened relations with China, triangulated the great power relationship, and he signed the greatest arms control agreement in the history of the world, which incidentally restored American military superiority, which Bob McNamara had given away by not counting the multiple independent re-entry vehicles, the 10 warheads per missile in the what President Reagan renamed the Peacekeeper missile. So it was, and he did other things. He founded the Environmental Protection Agency, which in his time was a serious organization of conservancy, and not, as far as I can see, as it is now, the essentially an agency for making war on commerce in every form. And this was a remarkably accomplished presidency. And in conservative terms, he was the last person who could lead a united Republican Party. He could make arrangements with the Rockefeller liberals and with the Goldwater conservatives. And since then, it's bifurcated. But I have in my pocket, because I wrote them out, the charges voted by the House Judiciary Committee against him, and they are nonsense. They're utter nonsense. I suspect I'd be wasting too much time and shortchanging my comment on Reagan if I read them to you, but if the occasion arises, I'd be happy to do it. But if you read them today, they are ridiculous charges, and it is incredible that this country ever got so worked up about such nonsense. I may conclude this by saying that even today, 50 years after his retirement, there's still no probative evidence that Mr. Nixon himself committed any crimes. Some of his people did. Pardon me. Ronald Reagan, I think, is an inspiring story. I believe, he was like Mr. Nixon from socioeconomically modest origins, and he evolved from a Roosevelt liberal to a Goldwater conservative for reasons. I mean, as times change, we change our judgments of things, and he did it gradually. And there was something magic about his career. I believe that he only had 6 jobs in his life: a lifeguard in Tampico, Illinois, a radio baseball announcer in Des Moines, Iowa, California bound in the Great Depression, a screen actor, including, I think, 2 terms as head of the Screen Actors Guild, vice president for public and personnel relations of General Electric Corporation, governor of California, and president of the United States. He had 4 elections. He defeated Edmund G. Brown, Pat Brown, who had defeated Richard Nixon 4 years before as governor of California by over 1 million votes in '66. 4 years later, he was reelected by about the same margin. He defeated President Carter by about 9 million votes and former Vice President Mondale by 15 million votes. It was a long career that just matured at a sober pace and ended in an extremely successful presidency. George Will and I were talking about this last night, and we both agree that he is the 4th great president in the history of this country, after, in chronological order, Washington, Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt. And he ended the Cold War, and he produced an immense economic prosperity. And Napoleon said the best generals are the lucky ones, and he was a felicitous man. I mean, the ball always bounced for him, and he made people cheerful. Even when he was shot and had, as Al Haig said, a round in the chest, and said to the doctors and nurses as he arrived in the hospital, "I hope you're all Republicans." He had great human qualities, and the people responded to them. So Mr. Nixon was a man for whom everything was difficult, and it was laborious, and he was himself a bit awkward, and especially compared to the Rockefellers and the Kennedys and Adlai Stevenson, these very elegant people. And Ronald Reagan was different. He was a man of modest origins, but just a very felicitous personality. But in their ways, they both rendered very great service to this country and to the whole world. Is that okay?
Thank you very much. Would you just add a little something of what is the greatest lesson from either of them, just choosing one, for sort of current Republican leadership, current presidential leadership?
From Nixon, that it is possible to compromise a bit and not lose your virtue. Mm-hmm. And I'm not suggesting that he always did that, but he did do that at times. And he was somewhat in the center of the Republican Party. And for President Reagan, I think it is possible to take what the left has successfully represented as an extreme position and sell it to the public as a moderate and sensible position. And he was one of the few presidents who did take an old image of yours, George, move center field, then he moved it to the right. But he actually went out and sold the virtues of conservatism as greater liberty for individuals. And you can do it. Now, of course, he was an almost hypnotic public speaker. It was quite inadequate to say he was a great communicator. He was really a remarkable orator. But his technique worked, and he did sell what had previously been pilloried as extremist nonsense as, in fact, common sense and good for the majority of people.
Thank you. So, George, what would you give us in terms of Nixon and Reagan's sort of portrait of their leadership, and then what would be useful from an understanding of their leadership for presidential leadership going forward?
Let me begin with a contrast between their temperaments, which Conrad, I think, has hinted at in a very suggestive way, and their political approach and their actions. Richard Nixon went into politics at age 33. He really had no life before that. Ronald Reagan went into politics at 55, having had several careers. Reagan was serene. He had decided who Ronald Reagan was and what Ronald Reagan believed. To understand Reagan, I think you need to understand the General Electric years. When he traveled the country talking to blue-collar men and women on the factory floors of General Electric facilities, explaining complicated matters in simple, declarative ways. Richard Nixon was an unhappy man all his life, so far as I can tell. Awkward, not fluent, uneasy about the contrast he felt with, as Conrad said, the Kennedys and the Roosevelts and the Stevensons. And a lot flows from the fact that Richard Nixon may have been the most socially insecure president, other than his predecessor, Lyndon Johnson, who also had a huge animus against the Kennedys because of their grace and their sort of unforced excellence, as the public saw it. Reagan, having come out of the General Electric years, had ideas. ISI exists because, in Mr. Weaver's famous saying, ideas have consequences. Richard Nixon, I do not think, had political ideas. He had resentments, which I think are poisonous in politics. He was most interested in what Conrad focused on, which is foreign policy. It's quite right that he did an enormously difficult thing. The hardest maneuver in war is retreat under fire. He liquidated a mistaken ground war of attrition on the mainland of Asia with a conscript army. Very difficult to do. But Richard Nixon, not having the preternatural confidence and cheerfulness of Ronald Reagan, took the world as it was and said, I must maneuver within its fairly clear boundaries. Hence, he wanted to manage the Cold War. Ronald Reagan, with his more capacious sense of the political horizon, said, I want to win the Cold War. I want to end it. Partly because Ronald Reagan had an extraordinary hatred of nuclear weapons. It obsessed his life. And he thought the world could and should get rid of them. Again, Richard Nixon wanted arms control. Understanding, as Nixon would, that arms control negotiations were maneuvers for advantage on the part of the two negotiators. I think it's fair to say that Nixon made Jimmy Carter tempting, that pious kind of, not a lawyer, I'll never lie to you, et cetera, et cetera. Carter in turn made Ronald Reagan necessary, in the sense that the United States was in pell-mell retreat and the Soviet Union was not just going into Afghanistan, it was going into lots of places. So it's important to understand temperament in politics. And Reagan's temperament equipped him to be a conservative as I define it. In my book, The Conservative Sensibility, I say what conservatives want to conserve is the American founding. And the American founding means limited government, separation of powers, enumerated powers for government, unenumerated rights of the Ninth Amendment for the citizens. People like me are today disparaged by some fellow conservatives as zombie Reaganites. I cheerfully say that with an asterisk. To be a zombie Reaganite is to be a zombie Lockean, Montesquieuian, Madisonian, Hamiltonian, because there is a direct line, a clear intellectual pedigree. All that Mr. Reagan said in its simplicity traces to those men in their complexities. And Ronald Reagan knew whereof he spoke. He was a voracious reader. But the experience on the factory floors at General Electric facilities meant that Ronald Reagan wasn't going to tell you he'd read Montesquieu. He wasn't going to tell you the pedigree of his ideas, but you were going to get the distilled essence of them. So I think one big difference is that, to put it this way, and then I'll subside, Richard Nixon's wage and price controls in August 1971 were the largest peacetime expansion of government power over the economy. And as good ISI people know, you know the economy and the political freedoms are indissolubly linked. It is inconceivable that Ronald Reagan would have ever considered what Mr. Nixon did with that colossally mistaken and promptly futile attempt to extend government control to the price of a box of Rice Krispies.
Thank you very much. So we've had the idea that it is possible to compromise in politics without, selling one's soul, right? But that it's also possible to sell extreme ideas, clearly as very much the values of the American people, and that we need to look at the temperament of those who are in the presidency, and that's something that we learned from the contrasting temperaments of Nixon and Reagan. What would you contribute to this picture of the Nixon and Reagan presidencies and what we can learn from them about presidential leadership?
I think I'll emphasize 2 points of continuity between Nixon and Reagan, and indeed points of continuity between both of them and our present day, and also 2 discontinuities between Nixon and Reagan together and where America is and where the conservative movement is in the 21st century. The first point of continuity with Nixon and Reagan, and here I both agree and to some extent disagree with what George Will has just said, is in the realm of foreign policy. I think both Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan can rightly be viewed as realists. Now, as Dr. Will said, Ronald Reagan went beyond mere realism and did in fact have a creative vision for the end of the Cold War and for the constraint of nuclear weapons, not just arms negotiations, but in fact an end to the threat of nuclear holocaust for the world. There's a wonderful book, the last book that William F. Buckley Jr. wrote, called The Reagan I Knew, in which Buckley says that he in fact had underestimated Reagan in this regard, and that Buckley had seen Reagan as a conventional Cold Warrior, whereas in fact Reagan was a man of a profound vision of peace for a world that had escaped from the shadow of nuclear annihilation. So that idealism is certainly present in Reagan. Nevertheless, what I think is a lesson for today from both Nixon and Reagan is the priority both of them placed on diplomacy. And diplomacy even with figures who were absolutely reprehensible, who represented the most tyrannical regimes on earth. Lord Black has already alluded to Richard Nixon's opening of relations with China. We have with Ronald Reagan his very daring diplomacy with Mikhail Gorbachev. And in both of these cases, these were tremendously unpopular diplomatic initiatives as far as movement conservatives were concerned. The conservative movement, there's this wonderful quote from Congressman Schmidt, who back in the 1970s said, "I don't have a problem with Nixon going over to China. I have a problem with him coming back." So Nixon's opening to China was seen as a betrayal of Taiwan by conservatives at the time, and it was seen as being, par for the course of an American foreign policy vision, which conservatives feared was drifting towards accommodation with the Soviet Union rather than an attempt to roll back Soviet power and get victory, not just an end to the Cold War, but victory in the Cold War. Nevertheless, Nixon undertook this diplomacy with Mao Zedong in the face of much conservative opposition. And it was a critical success for Nixon himself and for American grand strategy in the Cold War. And it enabled and teed up what was possible with Ronald Reagan a decade or so later. So Reagan, too, embarked on very daring and creative diplomacy with the leader of a communist state, in this case Mikhail Gorbachev. Once Soviet leaders stopped dying upon him, which was a common occurrence up to the mid-'80s, Reagan was then able to be both tough and idealistic, but at the same time very persistent in talking to Gorbachev and leading us towards a peaceful resolution of the Cold War, which almost no one could have imagined. There were conservatives who thought the Cold War would almost inevitably end with military conflict. There were progressives who thought the Cold War would end with a kind of merging, perhaps a slight softening of the Soviet system, but combined with a greater statism in America. Convergence was what this was called. So there were visions of the end of the Cold War, but they were very visions that were either apocalyptic or dystopian, as conservatives would see them. And in fact, Reagan was able to find a different answer to the Cold War, a different end that in fact did involve Western values prevailing. Certainly the West and its system was seen as triumphant, without military conflict being that conclusion. So as far as daring diplomacy goes, I think there is a continuity between Reagan and Nixon, and I think there is a lesson there for conservatives today. Now, how that lesson can be applied, we may discuss later in this conversation. It's obviously a very difficult question that has to be tailored to the times in which we live, which are not those of Nixon and Reagan. Nevertheless, I would point to the continuity there. I'd also very briefly say that there is a continuity in terms of both Nixon and Reagan seeing themselves as tribunes for the common American. And with Nixon, of course, we have the idea of the silent majority. But Reagan, too, was aware that working-class, blue-collar America was a constituency that could and should support the Republican Party, and that could, in fact, be reached with conservative ideas. And this affinity that both Nixon and Reagan felt for the ordinary American is, I think, again, not only a continuity between the two of them, but something that conservatives in the 21st century really have to recover or emphasize. I think we lost some of that in the 1990s after Ronald Reagan, and perhaps in the early 21st century as well. I will say, I think Dr. Will has brought up a great contrast between Nixon and Reagan in terms of temperament, but there's a sense in which both Reagan's optimism and Nixon's resentment or his his distance from the elite Americans represented by the Kennedys and by the Ivy League, both Reagan and Nixon in these regards, different as they were, represent something that the American public as a whole also relates to. In the case of Nixon, one can see grounds for the resentment that he had, not just biographically, but in terms of the rise of the New Left during his era. And the New Left of that time was a relatively small and politically repudiated development. It was a radical wing of the Democratic Party. It led to the horror of the Democratic Convention in Chicago. It led to the complete wipeout of the Democratic Party in the 1972 presidential election. So the New Left was a force already present in American politics, but it was something that was easily contained, and both Nixon and Reagan understood the need to contain it and were successful in doing so. This, however, brings me to one of the points of contrast between Nixon and Reagan and our own time. The New Left, which was easily contained, at least by strong leaders like Nixon and Reagan back in the 1970s and 1980s, is today not so easily contained and has become, I think, the dominant power within the Democratic Party. It is the source of what is today called wokeism. And the New Left is also dominant within the academy today. And the New Left itself, the professors under whom these radical students were studying in the 1960s and 1970s were often liberals of a older philosophical school, closer to being classical liberals, or at least liberals who took seriously the world of ideas and did not want to reduce ideas merely to power and to race and to these categories which today are obsessions for the woke left. So the rise of a very woke New Left counterculture in America has metastasized beyond where it was in the Nixon and Reagan years, and that presents conservatives with a very dire new challenge. Then lastly, I'll just say the other point of contrast, I think, between the Nixon and Reagan eras and our time today is on the issue of immigration. We had already quite high levels of immigration during Nixon, and Reagan himself was someone who was very open to the idea that immigrants bring many good things to our country. But we have seen, in the 50 years since Nixon and in the 40 years since Ronald Reagan, that immigration has been, we've tolerated far too much illegal immigration, and we've also taken a very open-ended view of the amount of legal immigration that we have. This has produced not just economic, but also a cultural sense of maladaption within our country. In some cases among immigrants. Immigrants, of course, are being colonized and approached by the ideology of the New Left. They're being told they should see themselves not as new Americans who have come to this country, but rather as new minorities, new oppressed persons who are in need of social services from centralized government, and who are also in need of the identity politics ideologies that the left wants to provide to them. So we have that development, which is very malign. And then we also have Americans, including previous waves of immigrants, who now feel as if they have been sort of cast aside by America's own leadership class, by businessmen who would prefer to import less expensive new workers, and by a political class, perhaps in both parties before Donald Trump emerged, a political class that prefers to have a new electorate rather than the people whom they are accustomed to courting as their voters. So I point to those 2 points of continuity and 2 points of rather drastic contrast.
So I think all of you have addressed in your remarks both presidential leadership with regard to the domestic situation, particularly talking about price controls or government intervention in the economy. You've also talked about foreign affairs and the importance of protecting American interests abroad. And then lastly, I think all of you have addressed to a certain extent the populist touch, knowing the interests and concerns or even the resentments of the people that a leader is representing, and then the ability to speak to those charismatically, address those, maybe even moderate those and show that those are sort of central to American concerns and values. So I'd just like to invite you to either respond to what others have said or to add to that portrait, the sort of portrait of leadership in the Nixon years and the Reagan years, and whether you see really a contrast between that conservative leadership and today's conservative leadership, or whether you see continuity.
First, I'd like to emphasize the difference of method between Nixon and Reagan. To simplify a bit, Nixon was a chess player, and he was engaged in his time as president in very intricate maneuvers to open relations with China and exploit the differences between China and the Soviet Union, but without doing anything irresponsible or reckless in terms of world peace, and all the while reassuring the allies in the Far East, Japan and Taiwan and others, that it was not going to be at their expense. And but it was an intricate, complicated thing, and he was a very complicated man. Ronald Reagan was comparatively a poker player. He came into office saying, when asked his proposal for the Cold War, we win and they lose. And he came up with this notion of anti-missile defense that has never fully worked, but it terrorized the Russians. It was a sort of a poker hand that he had, And it completely demoralized the Russians. And of course, they sank like a souffle. It was the greatest, most bloodless strategic victory in the history of the world. Not a shot was ever fired between the United States and the Soviet Union. And horses for courses. They're different men for different circumstances. But the application today, again, it's a different period. Obviously, there's some skills of leadership and techniques of conducting international relations that are timeless and always useful. But everyone in the room knows as well as I do how different this era is from the essentially bipolarized one of the two superpowers in which Nixon and Reagan operated. I should say, even though Nixon was a Californian native, he wasn't an optimist. Reagan was, of course, an adopted Californian, and he was an optimist. And Nixon, for all his foresight, was surprised at the quick demise of the Soviet Union. And Reagan was not, and that Reagan was correct. I don't think anyone, and certainly not, I'm not one who does, wants to get too far into a discussion of Donald Trump. But both the skill sets of Nixon and Reagan would be tremendously applicable in all circumstances. They're just a bit different, that's all.
Thank you.
I think it's important to understand that Nixon was present at the birth of the conflict between the elites and the masses, elite opinion and the masses, because he first stepped on the national stage in 1948 with the Alger Hiss case. Nixon was right. Those who said Alger Hiss couldn't be that way because he was from Harvard Law and he had clerked for Oliver Wendell Holmes. Nixon was right and they were wrong. And I think he was traumatized by the fact that he was the subject of so much vituperation for being right. And he never quite got over it. Ronald Reagan was from Central Illinois, where I am from, where men are men. And Reagan understood to win the Cold War, he had two conditions. He had to rearm, that is, you needed a 600-ship Navy, and he got it. But you also had to remoralize the Cold War. Reagan and Reaganites had been appalled that to preserve the spirit of détente, President Gerald Ford would not meet with Solzhenitsyn when he came to the country. Reagan would have met with him, there's no doubt about that. Reagan said, we're going to remoralize it because détente had indicated that it was just a power conflict and nothing more at stake than the balance of power. Reagan said, we're going to change the way we talk, because the way you talk doesn't just reflect the way you think, it shapes the way you think. So, he said, the Soviet Union is the focus of evil in the modern world, and people were aghast. He said, you can't talk like that. He said, oh yes, I can. And it's an evil empire. People said, it's shocking. Well, he said, it's true. And this to me was the real change. That was the end of détente. We were no longer trying to adjust our rivalry. We were going to end it.
Let me pick up 2 points that George Will has brought up, including in his earlier remarks. As I think probably everyone in this room knows, there has recently been a film released, a biography film of Ronald Reagan, which one can criticize it as cinema, but it has resonated with many admirers of the 40th president. The picture that it portrays of Reagan is a very warm one. It tells the story. It's based on a book by Professor Paul Kenger from Grove City College, which emphasizes Reagan's lifelong conflict with communism, including when he was in Hollywood, fighting communist influence within the Screen Actors Guild, all the way through to Reagan's time as president. I think, however, the Reagan film only gets at half of the story that Dr. Will has alluded to. Namely, it portrays Reagan the anti-communist very effectively, but it doesn't talk enough about the Reagan who believed in America, and the Reagan who was inspired by the ideas that he found in the literature of conservatism and of economic freedom as well. That in fact, the film does not present the General Electric years of Ronald Reagan very effectively. There's a funny montage in the film showing some of the rather silly commercials that Ronald Reagan made at the time when he was between his heyday as a Hollywood actor and his later political career. But what's omitted, unfortunately, in this film is the sense that Reagan, inspired in part by some remarkable businessmen within General Electric who had, in fact, as I've heard just recently, a background with ISI. These were businessmen who had contact with ISI and had the canon of conservative thought that ISI had composed. They had photocopies of this on their desks. And so Reagan was hired by individuals at General Electric, businessmen, who had been formed by the great ideas of Western civilization. And they gave Reagan the leeway to speak broadly about ideas as a spokesman for, a company, for General Electric. And Reagan himself took all that opportunity, and he had an enormously entrepreneurial streak. He was an autodidact. He was someone who did not rely upon formal educational credentials. He had a college degree, but really the education that came through most strongly with Ronald Reagan was the education that he sought out for himself through his own reading and through the influence of organizations like ISI, National Review, Human Events, and others. So what I fear is that by omitting that intellectual formation and by omitting the importance of Reagan's belief in a strong and healthy America as not just a counterweight to the Soviet Union, but really something which would be so strong as to make the Soviet Union look like precisely the Potemkin village that it in fact was. That by omitting that element, the idea of American strength, America as a healthy country, a good country, that the Reagan film actually misses something very important, and in fact which was more important than simply recognizing the evil of communism. That was absolutely essential, and yet even more important than that was the recognition that there was something good about the Western tradition and that America had a continuity with that goodness.
Thank you. I think that a lot of our younger ISI members, kind of younger conservatives, have an impression of Nixon and Reagan that while they won landslide victories, sort of historic victories to get into the White House, that they were, in some sense, handicapped by the progressive establishment in Washington, D.C., the control of the law schools, the control of the funnel into the justice system, the growth of the executive bureaucracy and its kind of independence from the ability of the president to shift it. And so that some of the things that Reagan wanted to carry out, despite his two victories and his long time in the presidency, he wasn't able to. What can we learn, and this is probably the last we can manage in the time that we're given, the last question, but what can we learn in terms of their leadership style within the executive and facing the kind of growth of a progressive establishment in Washington, D.C.?
Well, I'm afraid the lesson from Nixon is a negative one. He did have some paranoid tendencies, and they weren't, I think it was Bill Buckley who said even paranoids have enemies, and he had his share of them, but he tried, as if he was trying to get rid of a plague of locusts or something, he tried to stamp out elements within the executive branch hostile to himself and to his policies, and obviously that's not the way to do it. And in his own case, he carried a lot of baggage into the White House because of the rather some of the irresponsible things that he had said in the height of the Red Scare, and also President Eisenhower very skillfully deputized Nixon to do his dirty work for him while he smiled and everyone said, "I like Ike," very clever way to do it. But so Nixon, I think, was not a good administrator in that sense, but he did choose in key areas, outstanding advisors, and they didn't for a long time hold key positions. I mean, Henry Kissinger essentially was given most of the powers of the Secretary of State while he was National Security Advisor. Your friend Pat Moynihan had great influence as a domestic affairs advisor, and Mr. Burns was the great sort of economic advisor, and subsequently ambassador to Germany and Federal Reserve Chairman. But so Nixon worked well with certain individuals that he got on with, but he was too awkward and too defensive and too much abrasions in his career. He'd been in Washington for a long time. Mr. Reagan, of course, had never worked in Washington and was an outsider, and he came in with this California optimism, and other optimistic Californians like George Shultz and Caspar Weinberger and Richard Pearl and others, that they could do what they wanted to do. And in a way, I've always felt it was a strength of the United States that when the Northeastern establishment became rather demoralized in the Vietnam era, a California establishment was ready to take its place for a while. And I think the lesson we want from Reagan is very applicable. Get people you can get along with, that you can in general trust, and let them do their jobs, and keep an upbeat, purposeful atmosphere in the administration, and lead by example. And Mr. Nixon was not someone we want to emulate in those areas because it wasn't his nature.
Thank you. George?
As the only person in this room, perhaps, who actually voted for Barry Goldwater, I'd like to say something from the majesty of my 83 years to the impossibly young people in this room. And it is this way. I know when you're on your campuses, you feel surrounded. A Marine general, I think it was Chesty Puller, was in his unit. We're in dire straits. And he said, they've got us surrounded, the poor bastards. It helps to be in a minority. That is, you learn to argue, and you learn to understand what you think and how to explain what you think to other people. And Reagan did that, because Reagan burst on the scene with his time for choosing speech for Barry Goldwater in 1964, when Goldwater went on to lose 44 states. Reagan didn't care. He said, we're right and they're wrong, and we're going to convince them. I've always said that Goldwater didn't lose the 64 election. It just took 16 years to count the votes. So being outnumbered on your campuses is an advantage. You know, Kipling once said, he who knows only England does not England know. That is, you got to know the other side. You got to know other things. And people who know only woke don't even know woke. They don't know what they're rebelling against. And because of ICI, you come here and you get morally rearmed. Your quiver is full of all kinds of effective intellectual arrows. Whereas those people who are incubated in the bubble of wokeness on campus don't know how to think, they don't know how to argue, they're not articulate, and they're going to lose. You are, as Whittaker Chambers said, that when he left the Communist Party, he was going over to the losing side. Great pessimist that he was. You're on the winning side, you just don't know it yet. But be of good cheer and be confident, because they got you surrounded, the poor bastards.
So Dan, if you can give us some closing.
Well, I fear that I'm about to point to the storm cloud that comes along with this beautiful silver lining that George Will has just alluded to. First of all, I fully agree with what Dr. Will has just said about the condition on campuses. In my capacity with ISI, I work with our student publications division, the Collegiate Network, and I see students who are doing fantastic journalism as reporters and as editors on their campuses where they are perceived of as enemies, not only by the administration and by much of the faculty, but even by many students, especially the very woke activist students, who are very much like brown shirt fascisti. I mean, these supposedly Antifa leftists are in fact bullies. They're using the very same techniques that traditional, not just right-wing fascistic movements, but left-wing Bolshevistic movements have also used in the past in terms of intimidation and aggression. So the courage and the competence that I see from our student journalists is remarkable, and it is something that is always a source of encouragement to me, and it shows that George Will is exactly right, that we are getting the very best people. We are getting people who are intellectually well-formed, people who have courage, and people who have an entrepreneurial verve, which the bullies on the other side all lack. That said, what I do worry about, and a minatory lesson that I think we have to take from both the experience of Richard Nixon and of Ronald Reagan, is that Washington itself has what today is called the deep state. It has a permanent bureaucracy which has a culture that is antithetical to conservatives. When Reagan came in, he tried to strike a balance between his California friends who came with him, movement conservatives who had supported him for a long time, Rockefeller Republicans, some of whom were associated with the Vice President, George H.W. Bush, and various other factions as well. And what we saw is that many of the true believers, many of Reagan's old California colleagues, many of Reagan's most intense conservative philosophical supporters, they were in fact disillusioned by what came out of the Reagan administration, not because of Reagan himself, but because so many of the appointees within the administration were not true to conservative principle, were not true to Reagan's own beliefs and character. There was infighting within the administration, and of course, this administrative state was something that Reagan could not succeed in repealing or getting rid of, or even really curtailing over the long term in the 8 years that he had in office. With Richard Nixon, of course, we had Watergate, which Conrad Black has alluded to. We had Iran-Contra with President Reagan, and these kinds of conflicts between branches where, in many cases, officials within the executive branch itself will be working against the president. This has been seen more recently with Donald Trump, and I believe it's going to be seen the next time you get any conservative, anyone from the right, who is president and wants to try to change Washington. Washington resists that change and, in fact, uses all of its embedded influence to kick back against reformers, whether they're Nixon or Reagan.
Thank you. I think that this has given us a very balanced picture of the complexities that presidential leadership faces, and at the same time the idealism that we need to continue to have and bring to that office and to that responsibility to even take on the complexities. So perhaps we can all thank our speakers and we have a few moments for Q&A, so if anybody would like to ask a question.
Yeah, we only have a few minutes, so keep your questions short and with a question mark at the end. But you have the first
question mark at the end.
Mr. Will, quick side note before I ask my question, as someone who considers himself a Rockefeller Republican, at the beginning, Lenin called himself a Bolshevik when he was really a Menshevik. So whether we consider ourselves surrounded, I think that there is a large populace who do not yet know that they are on our side. My question really concerns the concept of understanding. You really, all three of you hinted at the way that Nixon portrayed himself and the way that Reagan portrayed himself being the more unpolished, Nixon being the more unpolished Washington lifetime member, and Reagan the more cultured is the word I would describe for him. I'm curious to know where the balance lies in that, where the insider and the perhaps populist lie. for perhaps future politicians and myself. Thank you.
Between populism and having an insider view of the complexities of the establishment. Yes.
Look, it's a good thing if you've got both. I mean, if you have both, it's splendid. But it varies. There are times when Washington is pretty well organized and the congressional leadership is reasonably cooperative, and that's all you really need. But there are times when you have to rouse public opinion under the congressmen and the senators to move them towards what you want to do. So it's really the president's evaluation of the circumstances he's in and how much he's got to work with in the leadership of the Congress. I mean, Nixon never had a majority for the Republicans in either house. Reagan had the Senate for 6 years, but he had to work with Tip O'Neill in the House. And he got on pretty well with O'Neill, but he had an emollient personality. Reagan was very versatile. I mean, he could lower the hammer if he had the hammer, but he could charm people if he didn't have the hammer. Nixon was not as agile a personality, but you need both, and you need them in different measure according to the circumstances you're in. Now, Washington, as everybody knows, is a terribly divided place, and it could do with a lowering of the temperature, but I don't see it happening at the moment.
We've got time for one more question.
Time for one more question.
Hi. My question is mainly for the concern of future conservatism. Of course, we've seen in the past with Reagan and Nixon the success conservatives have had, especially in their landslide elections. Today we have seen, at least in my eyes, kind of swaying away from old conservatism and moving more towards like a MAGA movement. Do you think it's like, now of course President Trump has used some terms by Nixon and Reagan with America First, peace through strength, and kind of showing some little hints of old conservatism. Do you believe that it is in the best interest to move towards that MAGA movement, or kind of move away from it and try to get more of the more Reagan and more Nixon that we had in the past?
And perhaps I could just add to that question ever so slightly, that Reagan also brought together the economic conservatives, foreign affairs conservatives in the Cold War, with the social conservatives, with concerns about the breakdown of the fabric of the family and moral values, and of course particularly with concerns about the legalization of abortion under Roe v. Wade. So I think it's an excellent question. So would anyone like to address the question? Yes, George.
Yeah. Without going into the specifics of our particular MAGA, anti-MAGA stuff, anger doesn't work over time in politics. Just doesn't. Bill Lee, the governor of Tennessee, said the other day, about a year ago, I guess, he says, "I'm a conservative, I'm just angry about it." Anger is off-putting. People say the American people are angry. No, the American people are exhausted and embarrassed by our public life. And let me tell you a story. At the closing days of the 1980 campaign, the issue was Jimmy Carter's meanness. Reagan will set young against old, white against black, North against South, et cetera. It was even the Washington Post, the New Republic, were all reproving him for his rhetoric. And I went out and got in a world of trouble subsequently for helping Reagan prepare for his debate, as though he needed a 39-year-old columnist to tell him how to communicate. And Jim Baker, who's running the campaign, took me and said, "We need something the governor can say when Carter gets mean again." So I sat down and typed up some sort of harumphing rhetoric as we're unworthy of the presidency, lowering the tone of our politics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Comes a moment in the debate, Carter says, Reagan hates Medicaid and hates old people and hates good health, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, here it comes, my words are going to make history. He didn't use my words, he used 4 words. He said, there you go again. Which is why he's president and I'm a columnist. But Reagan could have been angry. Reagan didn't get angry, not in public at any rate, because it is off-putting and it gets in the way of the patience of politics. It takes a long time to move our country. It should. We don't want to live in a country that is blown about by gusts of opinion. But Reagan had the patience of politics, and part of it was not being angry.
Before we close, would either of you like
Well,
to?
I'll just say there is an Aristotelian mean to be sought with respect to anger. So if you are insensitive, if you do not respond with anger to things that are genuinely provocative and wrong, the American public picks up on that, and they see you as being a bland politician who really doesn't have not just an emotional connection, but a moral connection with the country and its condition. And I think that's the danger that all too many Republicans, perhaps the likes of Paul Ryan or Mitt Romney, had drifted into during the Obama years, that there was this sense that many of the American people, especially conservatives, had good cause for anger, and yet they did not see their leaders having the same sort of response, both moral and emotional, to the condition of the country, with all these revolutionary changes that were being brought about, in the culture, in terms of an economy which seemed to be going away from hardworking Americans and instead rewarding both centralized administrators and also sort of globalist, utopians. Americans felt angry about that. Donald Trump tapped into that anger, and it got him elected president. Now, I would agree with George Will that there is a limit to what anger by itself will achieve, and especially in the long run, it's not going to be sufficient. There has to be something more constructive as well. And I think conservatives as a whole right now are asking themselves what that's going to be, how you get from the response that Donald Trump represented 8 years ago to whatever is going to be coming for 8 years or more down the line.
Thank you. Would you like a final word?
We're kind of in a transition, and Trump exploited and was, as far as I know, except for maybe Newt Gingrich, the only person who realized in 2016 how much discontent there was in the country. And he did make himself a very effective spokesman for that impatience and disappointment and frustration, which, to give him his due, was a remarkable achievement. And especially for someone who had never sought or held a public office or a high military position. He was just a complete outsider, and a terribly implausible outsider, because he was such an absurd figure in some ways. But we're now, we're sort of caught in the middle here, where half the people are angry and see Trump as their spokesperson, and the other half are embarrassed by Trumpism. And I'm afraid the Trump personality is making this a unique situation, but obviously it's going to be resolved. Either he wins or he loses, and if he wins, he'll go in 4 years. But again, I think we don't want to get into policy matters here, but he does represent authentically a great deal of public discontent and a great sense that the modest income echelons of American society have been passed over in favor of those better favored. And he has, as we all know, used traditional American capitalism through the tax system to incentivize job creation in disadvantaged areas. And he has poached enormous numbers of traditional Democratic votes in the fiefdoms of that party. So it's all in transition, but the transition is going to end either in a durable realignment or the end of Trumpism, depending, I think, on the outcome of the next election in a few weeks.
Thank you. Thank you all for this complex portrait. Thank you.